Lenny, why don't we talk about the ultimate goal and outcome of these 2 training sessions, what this is all about?
Obviously, this is to guide you guys and to help you guys to get to your certification process. So the whole idea with this is, as we said, a little bit of a prerequisite. It's not necessarily 100% that you had to do it, but if you have watched the masterclass videos, that would be of great help. That's just to get your flow system up and running in the initial stage. But the sessions after this that we're going to cover today on Thursday is really to help you guys get a little bit of a kickstart on your core certification process. There's some concepts that you need to understand and that we're going to look for when we mark the tests. And yeah, I think these sessions will just help you guys and prepare you guys from that regard. So with that, just a quick, you can use the thumbs up emojis if you're a millennial, or you can give me a wave on your self. How many of you guys have an actual up and running flow system ready? Okay, Brad, you can see the youngsters, they use the thumbs up.
I'm looking for the thumbs up here, but I can't find them. I got a hand. There we go. I got a hand. There you go. Cool. That'll have to do for now.
All right.
Oh yeah, I got it. I got a thumbs up. Hey,
here
cool.
Obviously, young, you will give me a thumbs up, the youngsters. Anyway, cool. All right, so that's good. So before we then kick off, just to reiterate the problem or what Flow does, I will just very quickly also just talk about the 3 things that we normally see when you do install Flow, what the pain points normally is there, and then we will kick it off with the first thing that you're gonna encounter in the core certification. All right, so if you've guys watched Masterclass, you would have seen next to the Masterclass project in the training portal, there's the option to also download the core certification test. Again, little hands up. Have you guys seen it? Do you guys know where to get it? Were you able to sign up for that course and that you get the files associated with the core training or the core certification? All right, yes, okay, Taylor, you've got it. All right, so let's maybe just very quickly run through that. So if you go to the Flow software website, if you go to the Help Center and you go to the training portal, obviously you will be able to go to the Flow Masterclass section. So this is our training portal. Obviously you've registered, you signed in, and then the videos for Masterclass is this course here. And then you've got the certification test that you can get. All right, so if you select this course or curriculum, it will give you the steps for the certification. It also gives you a file or 2 files that you can download that is required for doing that. I'm going to go through that in any case, but yeah, if you guys can maybe get that ready after Jeff has done his little bit, then we're going to start talking about the requirements there.
Cool. Jobs coming in. And Lenny, did you record? Just verify for me.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Welcome, Kevin.
Morning. Apologies. There was a Zoom link and a Teams link, and I was confused. So apologies.
Hey, sorry about that. Goodness gracious, didn't even realize I had a Zoom artifact on there.
But it was doesn't matter. Anyway, I'm here, and I'm going to make sure Frank can get in too.
Thank you. Kevin, just FYI, everything's being recorded, so obviously our plan is to reuse this for training in the future, so we are going to just observe good confidentiality projects and all that fun stuff. All right. Lenny, let's just real quick define the problem to everybody. There's 3 things that Flow is seeking to solve. Information governance. We want to provide a way for organizations to define their KPIs, to create a strategy around what they want to measure, what that's going to look like, and be able to go to their sites and say, here's the plan. We want to provide operational support. meaning we want to add immediate value to the folks in operations and give them the KPIs they need and the reports that they need to be able to do their stand-up meetings, to do their shift changeovers. And ultimately, the third big value add here is we want to help with enterprise data readiness. So all of the things that are getting defined in information governance, all of the things that are being built to help support operations, we want to create a really nice data pipeline so that the data scientists and analysts can easily get that information in the format that they need it, standardized, normalized, contextualized, ready to go for them to do their large enterprise data projects from. And so what you're gonna see as you're working with Flow is always going to be any effort that you make inside of Flow is going to play to one of those three or maybe all of those three use cases. Sam and I were just in a really interesting couple days in a Sesame presentation, and one of the things that as John from Sesame was discussing that really hit home is the exact same message that we've been talking about. And it's a slide that looks like this. It's this concept of 40 years of doing Industry 3.0. We've created all of these different applications. We've got all of these different systems. And every single time that we do another data project, we feel like we're innovating. We feel like we're advancing the ball. Unfortunately, all that we're actually doing is creating another stovepipe architecture inside of our organization. A classic example of this is if somebody says, hey, I want to do something with Power BI or a BI tool. Okay, that initiative sounds great. What do? They connect to Historian over to Power BI. They maybe grab some data from an MES system. Now, over inside of the BI application, they're going to start writing queries to those data sources. They're going to figure out how to merge and transform multiple data sources into one new output, put the right time limits from a duration or maybe an event or a day or a shift around that new information. And then they're going to send that out, maybe on a report, an email, or a messaging app. And the organization will get value from this, no doubt, right? And because they get value from this, then they start talking to an analytics tool like Seek. And they turn around and they start doing the same integration work inside of Seek so that they can get some type of a valuable output. Now with Seek, you don't really get to send that out quite the same way, but it kind of maybe lives inside of Seek. So if I want that information, I launch a Seek dashboard, perhaps. Get value from that. And we continue to do the same thing on the application side or on the system side over and over again. And this is that concept of a stovepiped architecture. I'm doing 80% of my time in this application is just on data integration, data connectivity, data assimilation, and I'm getting small pockets of value. But at no point have I centralized that work and actually done an Industry 4.0 thing. And so what are we trying to do is we are simply trying to create an architecture that provides a hub approach for data integration, contextualization, so that all the work that I do gets shared by all of the applications and the people that I want to serve. And so our focus is really around how do we create a centralized place where I am able to define what it is that I want to measure. I'm able to run those calculations, run those events, and then share that information, that integration work essentially with anything that I want to plug into this architecture. So this is where Flow starts to add value, but it comes first, like in order to get there, we have to shift our thinking and say, I need to centralize my architecture and provide this hub approach, a data ops approach, a single source of truth type of approach. And so everything that you're going to be training with Lenny on is really around how do I do the work one time and in a place where I can share it everywhere and over time continually. Cool. Thanks, Lenny.
Perfect. Thanks, Jeff. All right. So we're going to switch a little bit now into just, again, like I said, just do a little bit of a recap on Flow, how you get it started, how you get it going, how you get it deployed, and then any pitfalls that we normally see regarding that. So I've got my Flow Windows once updates. Let's close this. Cool. I've got my little Flow system here. It's up and running, and I can obviously go and create a new Flow project by opening up the Connect dialog here, and I can go and create a new connection or a new project. Give that project a name. Specify where the server or the SQL server lives, where it needs to create the database, and what is the actual database name that we want to create. Now, a few things that happens here is this server name here is not the server where you actually installed Flow. That's the server where it needs to go and create the database. Right, so Flow creates the database from scratch. It's the same database, the same schema that we generate. You don't have to go and create a blank database in your SQL scenario. We will take that and we create it. It's a Microsoft SQL database. So obviously you need to have a Microsoft SQL running. One thing that we do get quite a lot is, especially now with new SQL Express. So yes, you can use SQL Express to spin up a Flow instance. If you just go through the installation, you just go next, and do the SQL installation. What happens is SQL installs SQL Express with what we call a named instance. So what that will mean is if you want to create the database in Flow, you have to actually give it the name of that instance. Normally we do that with a backslash and we go SQL Express. So just be aware of that. If you do get issues creating your first project, then normally just check what your SQL instance name is. It's quite easy to check. If I go to my services inside of my Windows environment and I go and look for my SQL, you'll notice in brackets it will tell you what your SQL instance name is. MS SQL Server, that's the default name. So if it is that, I do not have to select that. I can omit it. But if it's any other name in there in those brackets, then that means there's a named instance running and you have to provide that name with that as well. Right, so that's one thing that we do encounter. The other thing that we do sometimes encounter is this username and password properties here. If you leave it blank, what we will do is we will use Windows authentication, so the current user that you are logged in with, to be able to create that database. So that user must have the create database access or permissions. Else, if you type in a username and password, we will use SQL authentication. So if you do have an SA SQL account, we will use that to create the database. Okay. Any questions maybe here? Were you guys all able to at least create a database, create a new project? Nothing wrong with that from that perspective. Perfect. Looks, yes. Oh, hands up. Cool. All right. So that's normally the only thing as we get is the SQL instance that we get an issue with. All right. So if you got your new project going, then the second thing we struggle with sometimes is just getting Flow deployed. All right. Now you'll notice under in my model section here, I've got this little gear icon. That's where we deploy Flow. Now Flow has got a few components. It's got the Flow server, which spins up the front end or the dashboarding, the data engine that does all the transformation, number crunching, calculations of the KPIs and stores that into our database. Message engine pushes the messages out via email or a Teams notification. And then we've got the integration engine that can now take aggregated data and push it to a data mart as an example. So that's our integration engine component there. Now, what you need to do is you need to activate these. You need to deploy them to actually spin them up so that they can actually start doing their tasks. You'll notice when you've got a blank system, they will all have these little gray disks. Gray disks in Flow means it's not active, it's not running. So normally what the guys have to do is you right click on your platform and you give it a deploy. And then you'll notice there's that little red dot that happens. Red dots and flow is error messages or error warnings. They tell you particularly if there's an issue. And normally that's step number 2 where people get stuck is the red dot just doesn't want to get away. So they can't get their platform to deploy or get running. Now, 2 things that happen is on that side is when you install Flow, what it does in the back end is it creates a Windows service. So if I, again, go to my services inside of Windows, and I go to my Flow Bootstrap here, you'll see that currently I'm running under a NT Authority account. That's the default account that the system will start up with. But that account that the Flow Bootstrap is running as must have access to SQL. Okay, because that service is the one that's going to communicate, store the data into SQL, and do all the interaction. By default, the NT Authority account will not have access to SQL. So normally what the guys do is they ask IT to create them a service account. That service account obviously has admin rights, and then they associate that service account to have access to SQL. If that's not possible, and we've seen this quite a lot with new Windows 11, especially if the guys use their MSDN account and to log into their Windows 11 account, obviously you can't use your email address to start up a service, right? So in that case, what we can do is we can leave it on NT Authority, but Flow has the capability to tell the Bootstrap, hey, don't use Windows authentication to talk to SQL, use SQL authentication. And the way that we do that is we can go to the system section, click on the properties, and you'll notice that there is a username and password field in here. The little highlight or the text next to explain what it does, it says this is now the SQL login account that we will utilize if you cannot associate your Flow service account to SQL. We use this a lot for if you've got an Azure instance of SQL that you need to connect to, or if you're using the new IoT SQL, we all then use SQL authentication to work that out. But as soon as you got that security sorted and you deploy your platform, you should see that the red disk does disappear at some point, and then you will have a running Flow system. Any questions on that? Anybody struggling with that? Everybody happy with their Flow systems actually up and running?
Presently have that error, diagnosing it right now, playing around with the login, like you said.
Okay, cool, perfect. All right, just let me know, Brad, if you don't come right afterwards, then we can quickly do a screen share.
Can do. Thanks.
Cool. Right, so when you now do the core certification, you're going to get 2 files. You're going to get an Excel file, and you're going to get a little file that you need to import into Flow. But I first want to kind of look at the Excel file that you get. So what we've tried to do is we've tried to create a little bit of a real world scenario. So this is an Excel sheet that the different departments at a company pulled up, and these are the different KPIs that they require. All right, so very important here, what they are telling us from this is, okay, that's our site name. We've got a calendar configuration here. So our year starts in April, our week starts on a Sunday, their day starts at 8 o'clock in the morning, and then they've got these 3 shift patterns that we need to look for. Very importantly, remember, Flow does aggregates based on a time period, minutes, hours, shifts, days, weeks. So we need to understand what the calendar configuration from the client is so that we can create those time buckets in the correct thing. And that's number 1 thing that you do in Flow. After you get Flow deployed and you get it running, the calendar is the next thing that you go and configure. That's like, don't even worry about connecting it to a historian or your data sources or whatever. Make sure that you know exactly what the client wants from a time aggregation perspective. Okay. How do I go and change this? Let's go back into my Flow system here. On the, I'm very dyslexic. You guys will learn that as we go along. So I always have to know this is Sure, I don't even have my watch on. This is left, this is right. So on the right-hand side, we have the little toolbox item here at the bottom. And if I click on the toolbox, you'll have the calendars there. Right, so I can have more than one calendar defined in Flow. I can have a financial calendar if the financial guys want to have different time buckets from the production guys. So I can have more than one of these calendars configured. Open up the production calendar here, and there is the components that I need to change. All right, so by default, the year is set to Jan. The day is set to 6 o'clock in the morning. The week starts onto a Sunday. And then you'll notice that you've got this concept of the minutes. All right, so by default, when we do minutely KPIs inside of Flow, it's every 5 minutes. We'll do an aggregate or a KPI. Obviously, you can change that to do that every 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, depending on what the requirement from the client is. So important to also note what that requirement is, what is minutely in their case. All right, so if I look at the sheet, obviously my year needs to start in April. My day needs to start at 8 a.m. My week starts on a Monday, and I can leave it as 5 minutely buckets. All right, so just be aware of that. Make sure that you set your calendars correctly. Now, in some cases, if your Flow system has been running and you've played with some stuff, these properties might be grayed out. I don't know if some of you guys have seen that, or maybe your systems currently, you cannot actually change these drop downs. And the reason for that is as soon as Flow actually created these time buckets, then we've got data associated with it, right? So we can't now all of a sudden just go change what the time frames is. If you want to fix that, then what you have to do is you need to do a purge action on that calendar. Purge will delete all the data. Then you can change the time frame and then just get your system back up and running again. So yeah, don't be alarmed if you do see that these block drop downs are grayed out. The reason for that is that there's already data associated with it. Okay, we also have this concept of auto purging. What this says is how long in the current running database do I need to keep hourly data, shiftly data, daily data. It's done in days. So if I say I want 3 months at least of daily data, then after 3 months, it will go and purge older data. If I leave it at 0, it will keep the data in my SQL database indefinitely. Okay, cool. Right, so that's the first thing that we do is we make sure that our calendar configuration is correct. Any questions on the calendars? Cool. All right. So make sure that you get your calendar settings correct as per this. All right. Now we've got a KPI that we need to configure. All right. So you'll notice that we list the KPIs. So the first KPI that we want to do is just a very simple water meter reading. So I've got a water meter, a flow transmitter for water, and I would like to know how much water do I consume at my plant, and I want to know that for every hour. Okay, so I've got an hourly KPI that's going to look at data. I need to perform an average on that data, and I need to get the data from a SQL database. Okay, so the Excel spreadsheet kind of guides you into what is the configurations that you need to do to get the data and where to get the data from. All right, now before I show you guys how to populate the raw data or the dummy data that we're going to utilize for this, I first want to talk about just data management in general. Okay, and I've got a few slides that I just want to run through around different aggregation methods and how we use them in Flow. Okay, so as I said, we're going to go and create KPIs, in this case, a water usage KPI for the hour. And I'm going to need to select a specific aggregation method for that KPI. Okay, so what you can select from is you can do a sum, an average, a min, a max, a counter, a range, a delta, first, last, count, time and state, variance. and a standard deviation. So that's all the different aggregation lists that's available that you can just select, and Flow will then go and compute that aggregation for us. Okay, but how does Flow actually do it? Let's look at some sample data. So remember, I'm looking at an hour, and I'm looking from 6 o'clock in the morning till 7 o'clock in the morning. If I actually look at the raw data that sits, can be my SQL database, it can be Historian, doesn't matter where it sits, there is a sample set of my raw data. Okay, so I've got 12 records here that fits in the 6 to 7 time frame. And if I plot it onto a chart, I'll get something like this. Okay, so if I ask you, how do I get the maximum or the minimum for that hour period from 6 to 7, what would your answer be? Let's do a simple one. Let's look at the minimum. What is the minimum value? So tell me which point number, 0.1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, which one is the minimum for the hour?
Is it 0.1 because it could have been 0.1 up into the 6th hour? Or not 0.1, yeah, number 1.
You are 100% correct, Kevin. Right, and that's very important to understand. What Kevin is talking about is the fact that this value, although it fits outside of the query window, right? This timestamp of this value is 5 minutes 26, right? Although it fits outside of the time frame, you still need to use that in your sample set because it only changed 3 minutes past 6. So for the first 3 minutes in the hour, the value was 1.6. Okay, so you cannot discard it because it falls outside of the range. All right, we call this the boundary value. All right, so there's a boundary value at the beginning and there's a boundary value at the end. Now, very important, guys, Flow looks at data in a stair-step fashion. We do not interpolate data points. We will always look at data as they change. So we do stair-step when we do the retrieve. So we will not interpolate between that point and that point to generate data there. We will bring that point forward and always do a stair-step from that perspective. Okay, does that make sense? Everybody happy with that concept? Cool. All right, so let's very quickly run through them. So most historians will actually give you this, as well as OPC HDA data sources. They will actually, if you ask for from 6 to 7, they will automatically include the boundary value. I know the Canary historian does this. I know the Aviva historian does that. All of them will actually give you, if it's a good industrial-based historian, they will do it. Stuff like an InfluxDB, maybe not. They don't understand industrial data. And obviously SQL. SQL won't give you this by default, right? You need to cater for that. All right, so let's look at an example here for a minimum aggregation. Okay, that's the one we talked about. So yes, when we talk minimum, we will include point number 1 in the minimum calculation to determine what is the minimum for the period. And in this case, 100%, it is 1.6. There was a 0.9 that was also 1.6, but the answer that I was hoping to get was exactly what Kevin said. Remember to add 0.1 in there. All right, some good use cases for this. You can think about it, pHs, tank levels, a level of a tank, if you want to do a little bit of stock taking, temperatures, quality samples, pressures. You'll probably do a minimum aggregate on all of those guys as just a few examples. Okay, all right, maximum. Cool. Maximum, exactly the same scenario. for maximum retrieval, we will include the boundary point in that retrieval. And the maximum in this case would be 3, which is 0.4 in the list, which is this guy right there. Right, so nothing funny there, but very important that we include the boundary value. Again, same kind of scenarios, what you will use cases you would use it for, pHs, tank levels, temperatures, etc. Okay, a range. Can anybody tell me what is a range retrieval? All right, range is the difference between max and min. Right, so again, we will use the boundary value in this case. We know the maximum is 3. We know the minimum is 1.6. So the range that this fluctuated within the hour is then 1.4. Ranges is very, very cool when we start looking at storage. What is the range of increase or decrease? And especially for temperatures as well. What is the range fluctuation of a temperature within a period? So we use range aggregates from that perspective as well. Okay, sum. What do we do with the sum? Do we include or exclude the boundary value for a sum aggregates?
Include.
Actually not. We exclude it for a sum because that point is for the previous hour, the total for the previous hour. So from a sum aggregate, we only add the totals that's been produced within, or the transactions that's happened inside of this hour. So we only add all of that. Since the 0.1 before the boundary, that guy is already then in the 5 to 6 o'clock hour buckets. Okay, so sum is a little bit different. We don't use it. Examples for this is very useful in transactional data. If we think about a historian with, time series data, sums is probably not the best aggregate. Doesn't make sense summing up temperatures or stuff like that, or pressures. But definitely when we start looking at transactional databases, if you think about weigh bridges and stuff like that, you want to get total weights that occurred over a certain amount of transactions, then we'll definitely use the sum aggregate for that. Okay. Next one is the first aggregate. So what is the first value in the hour? Yes, definitely. That's going to be the boundary. So the first value in the hour will always be the boundary condition. Yes, you guessed it. Last is the last value. Some good use cases for first, sorry about that, is tank levels. Again, not particularly used in time series data to look at the first value, a little bit more transactional. And then last, obviously, is the last value, which is 0.13. So that point there will be brought forward to 7 o'clock. And that will be then the last value for the hour as well. And obviously this point falling out of it, it's not going to be used. So we use the just before the end of the period. Okay, so again, tank levels, stock levels, mass balancing, you will use the first and the last. Okay, then we've got delta. All right, so delta is the difference between the first and the last. So what we'll do there, again, include the boundary value for a delta retrieval. Delta will be 0.6 in this case. So what we do is we actually do a delta between the previous points, and then we add all of the deltas together to give you the final results. So we'll say 2.3 minus 1.6 gives you 0.7. We'll go through each and every one of the record sets, and then at the end of the day, add all of the deltas together to give you the final result. Again, very good to look at depletion or replenishment of stock in your environment. Right, count. So if we do a count, all that we're interested in is the total number of samples that you see. Okay, so for a count aggregate, We're not going to include the boundary value that would have been counted previously. And in this case, the answer for the count is going to be 12. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 samples in this record set. So the count literally does that. It just counts the number of samples. What is it used for? Think about it. If I want to know how many times a machine stopped or started for a day, a valve cycles, how many times did a valve cycle or go in through its strokes, then we will use the count aggregate from that perspective. Okay. Then we have what we call time in state. Time in state is simply saying what is the time that a tag was in a certain state. Okay. Again, we will use the stair-step interpolation for this, depending on what the state condition is. So what we will do in this case is we will say, let's say I want to know what was the time that the tag was in value 1.6. Okay, so I want to know how long was it in 1.6. So we've got two conditions that satisfy that need. We've got 0.9, right? There the value was 1.6. But we've got another condition, right? The boundary. The boundary is 1.6. But remember, we can't take the 555 timestamp. We need to bring it forward to 6 o'clock. All right, so we'll do that. We'll look at the difference in seconds between the states, and we will then go and add those differences together. So the value we return in milliseconds. So we'll tell you that's the amount of milliseconds that the tag was equal to value 1.6. Cool. Make sense? Perfect. All right. Again, what do we use this for? We use this for how long was my CIP process or cleaning in progress? How long was my machine running for? How long did I utilize a certain piece of equipment? How long was a certain product active within the shift or in the day? So we use that quite a lot with utilization aggregates. Cool. Then we've got a variance. Variance is a statistical aggregate. Again, we will utilize the boundary value, and we use what we call a population statistical variance. All that means is we'll use all the points within the time period to determine what the variance is. And again, we'll utilize the boundary value for variance as well. The other statistical guide that we have is a standard deviation. These statistical aggregates is quite useful when you want to start looking at, how's my process parameters controlling? Am I in or out of my set points? How far am I in and out? It might even be used to validate data. If a certain instrument reads without a certain standard deviation of the rest, throw out the results. I don't want to use it. So it's quite useful to do a little bit of data cleansing, as well as to check how good are you inside of your control parameters. Again, standard deviation is pretty much the same. Again, it's a population standard deviation. So we take all the points within that to give you the standard deviation at the end for the hour. Cool. Next thing that we have is a totalizer or a counter retrieval. All right, this is now for those totalizers that we have, wettometers, flow meters, they all have this concept of totalizers at some point. So we need to be able to count the total that's been produced. But there's a little bit of a trick with totalizers. Sometimes totalizers will reset back to 0. Okay. So this is the difference between delta and counter, because you could have probably told me, Lenny, if I've got a totalizer tag, I can just do a delta retrieval, right? Because what is delta going to do? Delta is going to do the first value, last value, and subtract it from the 2. But what if it resets back to 0? At the end of the shift or the end of the day, they reset the counter in the PLC and it goes back to 0. What we do is we check for that within Flow. So we will go and do a counter retrieval. And what we'll do is, again, we definitely include the boundary value for counter, because that's the first value that you're going to compare against. And what we check for is we say, are they incremental if they are not incremental, so if the next value is less than the previous, we will auto detect a rollover. Okay, so then we say we're going to start at 0 again and then add the together. Now, in some cases, you might tell me, but maybe the historian didn't log the total at the end. It resetted, but we're missing a value point there. We call this the rollover value. If you know it, if it's an integer or something like that, and it's the max value of an integer, we do have the capability that you can specify the rollover amount. So that means that we will never miss that small little portion there if the historian, for whatever reason, did not calculate or capture that last point before resetting back to 0. So we do have a capability to counter for that as well. All right. So if we look at the example, if we did specify that the rollover was 3.5, we will then add a 0.3. So we'll go from 3.2, subtract 3.5, so that's a 0.3, and we'll add that to the total. Okay, so then it will give us a 3.9. What do we use counters for? Obviously, totalized values, bottle counts, weight scales, flow totalizers. So there's quite a lot of use cases for that. Okay. Any questions on totalizers? I think that's probably, between totalizers and time-weighted average, it's probably the most common aggregates being used inside of flow. Cool. Right, that brings us to the last one, time-weighted average. And time-weighted average will definitely include the boundary value. So in time-weighted average, we do two things. We actually look at the time between tags and the actual weighted value, and then we'll go and weight the value depending on the duration. So it's definitely different from average, right? An average does just one thing. It takes how many samples there was in the hour, and it divides the total with the total amount of samples. Time-weighted average weights the value depending on how long it was in that particular time. Okay, so what we will do is we'll say it was 1.6 for a total of 203 seconds. We will then weight the 1.6 depending on the duration, and then we'll get what we call a weighted value that's representing that timestamp. We will add all the weighted values together until we get the answer for what as the actual total. So a time-weighted average of a raw value should give you the exact same value as a counter retrieval if that same flow transmitter has a totalizer as well. They should be identical. The instrumentation does exactly this. It does an integral to determine the totalizer steps. So they should give you the exact same answer. Okay, just where's the integral getting computed? Either here or obviously on the instrumentation layer. So just be wary of that. One thing to be wary of time-weighted averages, especially in flow transmitters or anything that kind of records weights or totals, is if the value goes negative. So if the instrument is not calibrated correctly, you might get negatives here, and negatives will then obviously subtract from the total. So it's looked like you add product back into the process. So just be careful about that to handle negative values as well. So we'll take all of that. We will go and do the time-weighted average, which is the value multiplied by the duration. In our case, the duration is an hour. Divide that by the total of seconds for that hour, and then we'll get the weighted value. Okay, so technically, time-weighted average is an integral over the time. That's pretty much what it does. Interesting little side fact, if you do cyclic retrieval on data or cyclic storage on data, so if you tell me I want to record a value every 5 seconds rather than delta. Delta is what we like in industrial world. Time-weighted average and a statistical average will give you the exact same answer because the time frames or the difference in time is exactly the same. Cool. Any questions on that? Pretty straightforward. We've got silence. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad. Cool. Kevin says he's happy. All right. Why did I go through all of this horrible exercise with you? The reason I went through this exercise with you guys is the first example that we need to do in our certification test is data that we're going to retrieve from a SQL database. Okay, it's not going to come from an historian. Okay, so there's tip number 1. I think we actually added here in the comments at the end. All right, so the query that you're going to write to get this data back from SQL, you need to make sure that you bring back the boundary value. Okay, else you're going to get the wrong answer. Does that make sense? Cool, let's have a look at that quickly. All right, who was able to download the file for the core certifications? Do you guys have this Excel and the model file that was attached? Okay, doesn't matter. You can always re-look at the recording just to get that portion up and running as well. All right, so when you download the core certification test, as I mentioned, you're going to get 2 files. You're going to get the Excel file, and you're also going to get a little Flow model file. All right, so the model file you need to import into Flow. The way that we do that is we go to the System menu, we go to Import, and we then browse to wherever you downloaded that little model file. It's called the Flow Core Certification Base Import Model. We probably couldn't give it a longer name than that, but that's the horrible long name that it is. So that is the file that we need to import into Flow. Okay, what it's going to give you is it's going to give you in your model, it's going to give you a folder that's called Core Printers if you've done importing it. And in there, we've got two measures. Okay. One is to create a database. The other one is to populate some dummy data. Okay. So what you're going to do is it will also go and create a data source inside here that's called Flow. And what you need to do with that data source is the only thing that you need to make sure of is that you've got a connection to the database and that you're pointing it to the correct database. Okay. Now, in the core certification, it tells you that you need to call your database Flow, right? So just be aware of that. If you did rename your database to anything else, just be aware of that you then need to give this data source the correct name. Okay, so I called mine Flow MC. Just be wary of that. Whatever you called your Flow database, you'll notice at the bottom right here, Flow MC, there you can see what your database name is if you can't remember so quickly. We do specify it there. So just make sure that that database is called Flow, whatever you called your database. Okay. Then what's going to happen is you're going to have this create database guy that you're going to deploy. Just to show you guys what's happening here is we just create a dummy database. And again, depending on your database name, make sure that you use the correct database name in there. What this will do is it will create an integration database for you. If I open up SQL here, you'll notice that it will create a database called integration. If you then run the second measure, the one that says populate integration database, this guy will go and now populate dummy data. Okay, so it will just go and create some dummy random based data for a tag into a table called history values. And if you expand your integration database, there you go, history values. And you should see something like this, some data all the way back from March up until I think the end of the month. So we do populate some data into the future. All right, so this is the source that you're going to utilize to get your flow transmitter data from. Okay, and notice the timestamps don't fall on the hour. So you need to remember to bring back the boundary value for this case. Okay. Who wants to guide me? And if you're not going to put up your hand, I'm going to pick you. And I'm young. I haven't spoken to you in quite a while. So you're my victim for today. Let's help me. How do I write this SQL query to get data for an hour? Let's start there. Let's just get data from this database for an hour. Simple query.
Do we just do the where timestamp?
Yep, cool. All right, so let's do that. So let's add a where clause to the statement. So we're going to say where timestamp is greater or equal, and let's do it for 2023-03-1. And I'm just going to go 5 o'clock in the morning. Cool. So where it's greater than that, or where it is less than the next hour, which is 6 o'clock. And we need to make that an AND. Cool. Let's see what this spits out. There we go. So there's data from 5 o'clock. And it seems to end at 5:46. Let's just order it so we can get a nice order by timestamp. And let's execute. There we go. So 1 minute past 5 o'clock, and then 7 minutes to the hour. Right. Cool. This does not include the boundary. You guys see that? I do not have the point right before 5 o'clock. All right, so what do we need to do to get that?
Try to also get the last value before this time frame.
Let's do that. I'm going to copy this exact same query. I'm going to paste it, and now we're going to say, give me the first value that's less than 5 o'clock. All right, so we don't need the 6 o'clock. And we're going to say, just give me the top one result. Cool. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Right, so there we go. Midnight. Okay, so this thing didn't do anything from midnight till 5. So that is then the first value. Okay. Obviously, I can't return it in 2 sets. I need to return it into 1 data set. How do you do that? You union them. So I use the word union, and that will go and put them into 1 query statement for me. And there we go. Cool. Now I've got the point before 5 o'clock, and then all the values till 5 o'clock. Okay, so be wary of that. You need to be able to bring that value together. Okay. All right. What does a historian give us? When I query an industrial historian, what does a historian return normally what does a historian store? Let's ask that question.
Raw values.
Cool. What particularly of that raw values do we store inside of a historian?
typically like qualified values? So you get like a numeric value, a quality code, and a timestamp?
That's it. Timestamp, quality code, and a value. We call it a TVQ. That's or a VTQ, or wherever you are in the world, they've got different abbreviations for it. But technically, it's a value, timestamp, and a quality. Right. It's exactly the same thing that you have to return for Flow from your SQL queries. Okay, so I don't need to return the tag name. I know what the tag name is. I don't have to return this ID field. I need to return the timestamp, the value, and the quality. So I'm going to change my query a little bit. I'm not going to have the ID column in there. I'm going to have the timestamp, value, and quality. And again, just a little bit of side note for SQL. If you do a union, the columns must match. So what that means is this must be a timestamp, value, and quality. They have to match, else the union will not be able to put them together. So let's execute this. And there we go. TVQ, timestamp, value, quality. Okay. Now Flow can take these values and Flow can actually do something with it. Okay. So that, in a nutshell, is what I have to do just to get my first API going here. Right. So I have to retrieve it from a SQL database. That's the tag that I'm looking for, and I need to do a time-weighted average aggregate on it, and then I'll have to do some roll-ups. We'll get to that just now. Okay. Any questions on this query? Interesting little exercise. We actually played in the office the other day, and we said, well, let's see if ChatGPT can actually write this for us. We asked ChatGPT, give me a SQL query between two different times and include the boundary. And it was scary, but it actually got it right the first time. So yeah, it was quite impressive. But anyway, I digress. All right. Now, how do I put this into Flow? How do I put this to Flow? Okay. So I'm happy that my calendar is configured correctly. I'm happy that this model that I've imported generated the database. It also generated the dummy data. Now what I need to do is I actually need to connect to this data source. All right, this data source is called integration. Cool. So I need to go and create a new data source within Flow. I right-click on it, I say new, and I need to create a data source to this Microsoft SQL database. Okay, so you'll notice underneath Microsoft, we have the SQL database and the Excel workbook data sources. In this case, it's going to be a SQL database connection, right? SQL database, you can give it a nice name if you know what the source of this database is. Where does it live? It lives on my box, which is my Flow server Flow software virtual server 2. The name of the database is called integration. And again, I'm going to use Windows Authentication to connect to it. Hit the test button, and it will tell me if I've got a successful connection to that already created database. Okay. Other options here is you can specify your timeout in seconds. So this is how long your query should try and get values before we time it out. How many concurrent connections would we allow to create to SQL? And then what is the date-time precision that you are working with? So SQL has two date-time formats, datetime and datetime2. Datetime is up until millisecond format. Datetime 2 is all the way to nanoseconds. So just be wary of that. If you do play with databases with nanosecond time resolution, then you can just go and specify that we need to cater for that in the connector as well. So that all depends on the datetime field in your database. I think this datetime here is just a normal date time. Yeah, it's just date time. It's not date time 2. So we're going to keep it on the millisecond date time precision. Right. Hit save. And we've got our new SQL database. Okay. What is the first thing that you see there?
It's undeployed.
It's undeployed. Thanks. Yes, it's got a red disk. All right. If you hover over it, it tells you this database is not assigned to a platform. Please go and do so. Okay. We've brought this in probably 3 versions back or so, this concept that I would like to deploy my data source as close as possible to the source of where that data is coming from. Makes sense, right? So we've got this notion that I would like to deploy this data source itself. So again, if I go to my deployment view, I can go and drag the data source onto the platform. The platform is the top node, right? And that will then associate this data source to this platform. If I've got an architecture where I potentially have an historian on a different node or a different SQL box, I can go and create new platforms within Flow, give it an IP address of where that lives, and then I could have associated this platform or this data source to that platform. All right, so that will now physically spin it up on that node. So we try and get it as close as possible to the source of where that data lives. For now, I'm just going to keep it on my box. All right, remember, red is error, gray means inactive, it's not running, so I need to go and deploy it from this perspective. Cool, it will go red, it's busy starting it up. As soon as it is started, I should see an active component. There we go. Cool, so my data source is ready. I can now go and configure a measure or a tag to actually retrieve it. Okay, now very important, another part of the core certification is you'll notice that when you go through the steps, it's going to tell you you're only allowed to use tags. Okay, now tags is maybe something that's new to a few guys. I'm thinking of Zhang and Brad. I don't know if you guys have seen the tag concept. You've been working with it for a while without having to worry about tags. But for this certification, we will go and specify that you must use tags. Okay, so let me explain this quickly. We do aggregate data into time buckets, minutes, hours, days, shifts, whatever the case is. But what if you want to do some pre-cleansing of that data before you go into that aggregate? I want to remove outliners. I want to potentially remove negative values from my flow transmitter. I want to potentially apply a rule to say, only look at this value when I'm in a certain state. And that state can come from a complete different data source. It doesn't matter. So we brought in this concept where I can actually start playing with the raw values before I aggregate them. And we call them tags. So you'll notice there's a new icon in the flow zone, and that's what I call a tag. Okay, then we have the normal minutes, hours, days, shifts. So what I would suggest you do, it will save you some time. In your defaults bar here at the top, just pin it to tag, and it will create tags automatically for you. All right, so then you don't have to worry about that. Okay, so let's see how we change our query into a tag that I can then utilize within Flow. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a folder here. I'm just going to call that my utilities. Utilities. Cool. If I look at my little Excel here, the categories is going to kind of guide you how to build your model. So you're going to have a utility section. In that utility section, you're going to have a main water supply. So what I will then do is under utilities, I'll probably add a folder here for water. And then I'm going to add a metric. Metric is, what do I want to measure? I would like to measure total water, right? So that's my metric man. How do I get to the total water for the hour? Well, I'm going to create a tag based on my SQL data source. Okay. What we will do is we will browse the table structure for SQL in the namespace here. So you can see there's the two tables. And if I expand my history values there's the value section or the value tag. If I do drag this across onto my metric, it will create a tag for me, and I'm just going to call this my actual tag. All right. One thing that this SQL does not have is a unit of measure. I think we do specify that in the file as well. So yeah, it's kiloliters per hour. All right, so I can just give it a nice kiloliters. There's a unit of measure. And then you'll notice it says no data. Well, kind of makes sense because we haven't transposed our query into this. Okay, we give you a very basic query based on the column that you've dragged. You're never going to kind of use this, but this is now where I need to go and populate my query. Okay, so let's do that. Let's go back into Flow and let's copy my query here. Normally what I do, because Flow already knows it's the integration DB, so I don't really have to specify the schema part, this part of the schema for that. So that's not really necessary, but I'm just going to go and copy this whole thing. Control A, copy, and then I'm going to click on the little ellipse button here and then paste in my value. Right, but there's a problem, right? The problem is that I've hard-coded it for a specific hour. Because I was just testing, I'm just playing, just trying to understand how to get the boundary value in. I can't leave these times here. All right. You'll notice that there's a little time pickers here at the top. So technically what I want to do is I want to be able to pass in these times into these as placeholders, and then it should go and query the correct date range for me. Right. How do we do that? So in Flow, we've got placeholders for those parameters. We call them period start and period end. Period start, period end. We notate them by brackets. So wherever you have your first date, I'm going to replace that with period start. Right. And when I had my end date, I'm going to replace that with period end. Cool. And then this guy, which is my boundary, that is going to be period start. Cool. Right. So this is internal. Flow will replace this when it tries to pull the data, and it will put in the correct time frame that I'm looking for here. Okay. Does that make sense? All right, let's say okay. Let's give it a refresh. And let's see. There we go. I've got some data. Raw data. Okay, Flow's done nothing with this. This is now what we call a tag. Flow does not store tags. We do not replicate the raw data that we get back from a tag. Okay, just be aware of that. This is now literally a view into your data source to see what the raw data is that you're going to play with. Okay. Now, I can now take this raw data, and if I now drag it onto the hourly icon, I can now say this is my hourly usage of water. I'm going to do a time-weighted average retrieval as per the Excel document. It's going to say time-weighted as the retrieval. There we go, time-weighted average for the tag. All right, so I'm going to leave it at average and I'm going to deploy it out. Flow will now ask those chunks for the time buckets, for the hours, and it's going to process them. And then hopefully when it's done, I will go and have my values for my hours. There we go. And this is what we store in the database. The result for each and every hourly bucket is what we then store in the DB. Okay, does that make sense? Does that make sense to kind of have this first requirement met? Okay, then it's going to ask you for some roll-ups. Okay, it's going to say, I would like to have a shiftly total, a day-to-date total, and a daily total. Okay, how do I do that? I literally take the hour, drag it onto the shiftly icon. That's going to be my shiftly total. I'm going to take the hour, drag it onto the daily icon for my daily total. And then for the progressive, the shift to date, I'm going to take the hourly icon and drag it onto the hourly icon again. And that's going to give me a shift to date. Okay, deploy that out. And I've got those metrics. So this will give me a total for the day. There we go. There's my daily totals based on my calendar, which is 8 to 8, very important. So a day in my case is from 8 o'clock to 8 o'clock based on the requirement that I had for my calendar. And my day starts at 8. Cool. Does that make sense? Who needs help very quickly to get their databases created and sorted? Obviously, you guys can always look at the video afterwards, but this is what we need to do to get this first part of the requirement of the video. All right, all happy. Cool. All right, the next portion of the requirement is going to look at a KPI that we call TAED. Target, actual, efficiency, and downtime. Okay, so this is for the operation, guys. This is based on 2 filling machines, filler 1 and filler 2. And the objective here is to do a little bit of short interval control. They would want to see if they're going to make their production targets before the shift runs out. And we've got our, again, very similar, our interval, which is our daily, hourlies, etc. We've got our type of measure that it is. It's a manual measure, the initial value for that measure. And again, it will also tell you against which database it needs to pull it. All right, so now it's going to tell you that it needs to get the data from the simulator. Okay, so the data source that I need to use in this case is going to be the simulator. So we're done pretty much with the SQL database. Okay, so the only objective with that SQL database was the whole notion to understand boundary values. Yeah, so that's the initial idea with that. After that, you're not going to use the SQL database again. For the rest of the labs, you are going to use our normal simulator. Again, if I right click on the data sources, flow software, you store in simulator, create that. Again, remember, it's going to be red. Same kind of process associated to your platform. And then it's going to go and deploy this out. Okay, it's going to go red. What's going to happen is it's going to build you a namespace or some tags. So there's the packaging area, there's filler 1 and 2, and there's all the tags associated with that. So you'll notice it does specify what the tags are. So there's the bottle counts for the 2 tags, and it comes from the simulator. For the second part of the solution, you are going to use the simulator data source. Okay, very importantly, the core certification steps is going to specify that you use templates for this. Okay. Now, I've created this first one without a template, just to show you the concepts. Just make sure that you create a template. Okay, and there's one very important thing that I want to show you guys with templates before we're probably going to call it for today. All right. The whole notion of a template is that I would like to measure the same piece of equipment exactly the same way. Doesn't matter if the historian tag is different. Doesn't matter if it comes from a different data source. And this is what Jeff was talking about a little bit around data governance. When I look at a KPI for a piece of equipment, I would like to know and trust that that KPI is equated the exact same way for the exact same piece of equipment. Doesn't matter where the source of that data is coming from. Okay. And that's how we use templates to enforce a little bit of that governance of how KPIs are getting calculated. All right, so I'm going to do one of these just to show you guys how it works, just to be able to cater for different scenarios and different different tags in the historian. Okay, so if I look at my data source here, I've got tags for filler 1 and I've got tags for filler 2. Okay, I've got counter tags. So if I look at the counts here for this, if you double click on these tags to look at the raw data preview, it will take some time. The reason why it's taking some time for this initial load is it's actually physically building the historical data for this data source when you do it the first time. So how the flow simulator works is it generates 3 data into the past, 1 month into the future of all of the data tags that's provided here. So what it's doing now on the back end, it's physically building out the data. It does it in a little flat file format, and when that's done, you will see your tag. So don't be alarmed when you see this the first time. It does take some time to do it, but after it's done, the data is there, and it will be fast for subsequent retrievals. Yeah, so this does take some time, but let's look at the tags so long. What is the difference between this guy and that guy? What's the difference between the tag naming structure of filler 1 and filler 2? The only difference is that one says FL001. This one says FL002. So there's a nice structure, right? So I can very easily utilize that to auto address these tags based on the filler that I'm going to create the template from. Right. So how do we do that? Let's just see if this thing is done. That's cool. All right. So how do we do that? Let's go to my template here. So I'm going to go to the little cube on the right-hand side. That's my templates. And I'm going to create a folder structure. This is my site templates. And I'm going to create a template for a filler. Cool. What would I like to know about that filler? I would like to know what is the throughput. Cool. So it's exactly the same like I've built in the model side, the exact same icons. I'm only doing it now from a template perspective. Right, so I'm not going to call it filler 1, filler 2. I'm going to create a template for a filler, And I'm going to utilize the tag names to go and specify what they should auto address. All right. So the first thing that I'm going to do, remember, you must use tags. So I'm going to create a tag, and this tag is going to be my actual tag for my model counts. Okay. So I'm actually just going to rename it to actual good. So this is my good counter. Right. Let's open it up. You'll notice it says it's red. It's got no retrieval properties, so that's 100% correct. I've not associated it to any data source at this point in time. I'm going to add my bottle count. Right, so there's my good bottle count tag. I'm going to drag that in here, and it's going to go and populate this. Right. This is wrong, right? I cannot hard code it to that tag, because if I instantiate it twice, it's going to use the same tag. Doesn't matter if it's filler 1 or filler 2. So I need a way to parameterize the filler number. Okay, how do I do that? In my toolbox, I've got this concept of attributes. Okay, and I can go and create an attribute. And in this case, my attribute can be an equipment number. It can be a filler number. It can be any kind of placeholder that you would like to use to auto address in this case. I'm going to call it my equipment number. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to associate my equipment number with my filler template. Okay. Now, you can do that at any level in the template. Okay, what I mean with that is, if I associate the attribute at that level of the hierarchy, so if I add it to the folder level, everything below it will inherit this model attribute. Okay, so if I open up actual, you'll notice that, oh, it's got the model attribute already, because it's inheriting it from the top level there. Okay. Now what I can do is I can say, oh, okay, it's not 001. I can go and replace that with this model attribute. And if I'm not mistaken, you can drag it in, else you can just type it out. And again, brackets, that's how Flow knows it needs to replace stuff. So everything in brackets, Flow will go and replace. What does it need to look at? It needs to look at a model attribute, because you can have multiple of these attributes, right? Historian names, area codes, equipment numbers to make up a quite complex tag name. In this case, it's going to be a model attribute, and the model attribute you specify by its name. In this case, it's going to be my equipment number. Okay. So it will replace whatever the value for equipment number is in this placeholder here. Okay. Right, let's close that. Let's go back to my template. Now I can use this to do an hourly value. So this is going to be my hourly bottle count. And it is going to be a counter retrieval. Why counter? Let's see if I've got some data that's now done. There we go. It's a counter. Okay. So I need to go and do a counter retrieval based on the raw data. That is exactly that. Right. I'm not done. And the reason I'm not done is the following. Let's release my template. Let's go and add to my model. I'm going to add a section here for packaging. And I would like to go and instantiate 2 of these filler machines, right? I've got filler 1 and I've got filler 2. Filler 1 and filler 2. Okay. So if I drag the filler across to my model, so what I'm doing is I'm taking the template and I'm instantiating it. Sometimes what you will see is you want to drag something and it doesn't want to place it. You get no confirmation that you can actually do a drop operation. That is because, again, it's gray. Now for a template, the gray disk means it's not released. I cannot use it in production. So, and the reason for that is I might be busy with it as an engineer. I'm not done with the template. I would like to go and make some changes. So I don't want it to be able to be instantiated in production. So let's release that. Now, after the release process, I can go and drag and drop it onto my packaging folder. What it's going to do is, what did I do? What's my there we go. Sorry. All right. So now it's going to ask you a few things. It's going to say, okay, how many of these fillers do you want? I would like 2 fillers, please. What would you like the equipment numbers to be, sir? All right. So we know I need to replace 001 and 002 in my placeholder, right? So I would like to replace those from the value 1 to 2, but I need to pad it with 2 zeros to replace it with 001 or 002. Okay. Now let's preview this. All right. Oh goodness, there's an issue here. Why is there an issue? Because I'm telling it to create 2 filling machines, but I have not specified what should it do with the names for this. I would like this to say filler 1 and filler 2, right? And that's why you see it says filler already exists. So I'm just going to create a copy of that. When we try and highlight with the red dots, there's a little bit of a configuration issue within here. So how do we fix that? Each and every one of these names, so if I look at the folder there, you'll notice that it's got this concept of an instantiated name. And again, I can take my model attribute, drag it in there. So there we go. Drag and drop of that works. And I would just like to add the word filler in front of it. So it's going to take whatever the equipment number is and add that to the word filler there. And I'm going to do exactly the same with the metric. Metrics in flow is always unique. So I need to say this is filler, number, and then the word throughput. Oh. Cool. There we go. Let's see what this does. So I'm going to do that operation again. I'm going to drag it into my model. Okay, I would like 2 fillers. I want the values to be 1 to 2, padded with 2 zeros. If I now look at the preview, there we go. Filler 01, filler 02. Okay, not 100% correct. I need 3 or 3 decimals. So I'm just going to pad it with another 0. Hit the preview. There we go. Filler 001, filler 002. Okay, that looks quite cool. Hit the continue button, and that will then generate it in the model. And I should have my 2 fillers with its 2 metrics, with its 2 tags, and then the aggregates. If I deploy them at this top level here, it should work. Let's have a spot check. This filler here has replaced it with 001 as the equipment name. So let's pop that out. And if I drag filler 2 at the bottom, there we go. It's completely different values. So that seemed to do the replacement automatically. This guy is 002. That's what I wanted. So if I look at the hourly values, they should have equated already. There we go. And drop that, and then let's put them together. They're definitely different. So that seemed to work quite well. Cool. So that's how I'm going to use the templates with this concept of model attributes to automatically address the tags for my fillers when I'm building the templates for these guys. Okay. Any questions around that? right, I made a big mistake. My unit of measure is completely wrong. Bottles can't be percentage, it should be count. Let's see what the unit of measure should be bottles, it should not be percent. Okay, how do I fix that? Luckily for us, I'm using templates, right? So I'm going to fix it in the template level. So if I open up the tag here, I can go and change the unit of measure here to bottles. Okay, you'll notice that the template has these lock icons. Now the lock icons allows me to do propagation of changes. It also allows me to inhibit people from changing certain configuration on the instantiation side in the model. So if I lock the unit of measure on the template level, let's do that. I'm going to lock it on the template side. I'm going to release it. I'm happy with that. Now you'll notice I've got these little blue icons in the model. Blue icons means, hey, somebody made a change to the template. Do you want to apply that change? Yes, I would love to do that. I'm going to do what we call a recursive update. Recursive update will run through all the sections here and change it, and there you go. Bottles, all right, and now it's locked. So I cannot change that unit of measure on this level inside of the config tool. It's locked. Nobody can change it. And that's another little part of data governance, is that we can lock some of these properties. I can lock the retrieval. I can lock that it's a counter retrieval. So it will always have the same aggregate method when it's trying to get the values back. Okay, so just a little bit on the template operation there as well. Any questions on that? Is it kind of starting to make sense, the way that we've documented it versus the way that you're actually going to go and configure it within the tool? We try to make it as close as possible to a real world scenario to kind of do this configuration here. Okay. All right. Any questions? Else I'm going to give too much away.
Will you at some point talk about best practices for setup, being able to use views, store procedures, and other kind of templatizing processes, standardizing setups, that kind of stuff?
Cool. We can definitely make that a little bit of a topic as well, Kevin. I think another important one is fault finding. If I've done something wrong, my query is wrong, I'm not seeing the correct values, how do I actually fault find what Flow is actually doing? So yeah, I think that's two good topics, of fault finding and just a little bit of a setup, best practice, store procedure, that type of stuff. Definitely that's something that we can look at in a session, yes. The idea for today was literally just to get you guys going, understand what the requirement is from the file, and then just very quickly understand this concept of the boundary value, because that's something that we definitely need to get right when we do the certification process.